the verse at the end of the Gospel is written over the place where people preach in the city temple in the middle of Cardiff. That is a large Pentecostal church, but a place where things have happened since it was built. And this verse, all those who touched him were healed, is written there in calligraphy for all to see, for they take his promise seriously in such an ambiance. That I found too when I was in France, because there the Renewal was entirely Catholic. As you may intuit, there is a slight Americanization of things in charismatic Renewal in Ireland and England sometimes because of the cross-fertilization with the States and therefore with the link with Pentecostalism in the Protestant field. Go to France or indeed to Italy and there's none of that, therefore it's purely Catholic. And my own experience in France was very Catholic in that sense that because of the contacts and what we were involved in, it was a specifically monastic form of renewal. And in the 80s, we were en plein, in the fullness of that explosion of rebirth which was following the council years, and the nascent orders, congregations coming out of it. There were big ones. And one of the biggest was the one that is now called a Beatitude, the Beatitudes. At that time it was still called Lion de Judah, the Line of Judah, but they were growing at that time at the rate of 2 monasteries a year in different countries of the world. And they were monks and nuns, or whatever you want to call them. They had the habit, full habit, and also priests, their own formation, and couples. They had all the possibilities within them. But fully Catholic, and very much backed by the bishops. And they, because of their full engagement, that is, all their time living together, and all their worship created together, they were able, because they were all young, to create extreme beauty on earth. You imagine a situation where you have a church full of young voices, able all to sing and in harmony, and not only that, but to get the best of the liturgy from all traditions possible, and you can imagine the kind of beauty that was being created there in France in the mid-80s. With all the senses involved. They were into things like creating, painting icons themselves, artwork of a great quality, and they were also into taking the best of all that they could find. Therefore, they could sing very well Gregorian chant. They could sing, and that was their speciality, Byzantine chant. And they were taking on, actually, a lot of the Eastern liturgy in a Catholic situation and with approval. They were also, because of their speciality of outreach, taking on a lot of the Hebrew inheritance. And the result was that they would start the day with the 18 benedictions, or rather the one Christian one was modified or left out because there was one malediction aimed at the Christians. And the result was that they also celebrated over the weekend the Jewish Shabbat, fasting without eating anything from the meal of Thursday midday through the night with all-night adoration, all Thursday to Friday, eating nothing at all Friday in the morning, Friday midday, nothing at all, until the beginning of the Shabbat. And that would begin with what St. Joseph would have performed as head of the family. The taking of the commemorative chalice and the filling of it to overflowing, because there was a small kind of platter underneath it to hold what is to overflow. And when it gets to the top, there's a tiny shake and over it flows. And the question of why they do it, to remember that my cup is overflowing. And then, after the celebration of the Shabbat in the Jewish mode, with actually Hebrew chants, which they've learnt very well, they have Hebrew dances, which all partake in, including the children. It's very beautiful and very pure, all to the Hebrew music which they are able to produce. And no fasting at all on Saturday, and then the Sunday celebrated as the resurrection, with the vigil lasting between 3 and 4 or even 5 hours, starting with Vespers on Saturday in an Eastern style, but with this particularity that all the charismatic gifts would be there. Prophecy, words of knowledge, singing in tongues, healing, all there. Why? Because they were taking seriously the Lord at His word. And where they take Him seriously, the Lord engages and takes them seriously. And one day, we were there, we were all called into the equivalent of chapter, and La Bergère, the shepherdess, Sister Catherine, told us things. And it was this: tomorrow, the printing press is arriving. It was a huge industrial affair coming from Paris. From there, henceforth, was going to be issued all the literature of the nascent congregation. And she told us this. Last night, I was talking to the one who had been superior of this monastery when it was in the hands of the missionaries, might have been the Père Blanc, the White Fathers. And the monastery was an old Cistercian abbey, l'Abbaye Blanche, going back to the Middle Ages, the beauty of the monastery. And the missionaries had taken it over as a house of formation until they had grown less numerous and found it superfluous to their needs. It was a large monastery, and they proposed it to this very powerful community growing all the time. But the superior came back to share one or two things with Sister Catherine that actually previous evening, and it was this. The superior told me this last night. One day they were about to vest, and the sacristan was preparing the vestments for us all. And just before we marched into the sanctuary, something strange happened. We could see her face changing. She was in a different world. We could see that she was actually in an ecstatic mode. She came to, and we wanted to know what had happened. And she told us this: I saw the future of this house. I saw, and by the way, remember the name of the community of the slain lamb. It is the community of the Line of Judah and of the slain lamb. And she saw this: I saw a great fire coming from this place. Fire here, and from it great rays of light extending far and wide. But I also saw something strange. I saw a lamb. Now, the name of the magazine that was to be produced henceforth there was feu et lumière, fire and light. And it was the main, and still is the main, review of the charismatic renewal in France. But then also they were starting one for children, of which there were a great number. Étincelle, sparks. And they had their own artists in community to do all the things for the children with messages. So eventually it came, all this equipment, and it started to run. And all these thousands had to be produced, magazines going all over France and Canada. And I was present at one expedition, and it was interesting to observe all these young hands at work in mode of prayer, and yet it was not just any work. There was so much power in these testimonies going into these pages that it was actually quite a nuisance to you-know-who. And inexplicably, things in these perfect machines would at crucial moments go wrong. And it was actually before our eyes happening, and you could see it. And they who had experience of Old Nick were quite calm. Now what it was Old Nick just wanted to be just enough of a nuisance in sabotaging things that it would more or less carry on, but just at the crucial moment it would stop, and so on. And one of the brethren just calmly and serenely just said, "C'est lui. Il veut nous faire peur. It's him. Just wants to make us afraid. Don't worry, we'll do it manually." So that was it. Don't try it against Old Nick. There are other classical means. So they had to be wrapped manually. And on it went. And the word got out. And they were reaching all the monasteries of France. What were they? They were just a mélange of things that were happening and meditations to link them up. Doctrine, faithful to the church, but power, uninterrupted, coming from the upper room. This takes me back to the first reading, which I'd like to dwell on for a few seconds, because it is precisely the Old Testament form of creating that throne of glory, which I noticed they were well able to do in this community. Did you notice that the word Devir is actually used? Devir is the Holy of Holies, the Sancta Sanctorum, in this reading. Did you notice also that the cherubs are there on their wings? Not very different from that, I would say. Got one of these on one side of the tabernacle and other ones on the other side in my hermitage. And there you've got another good angel. It may be St. Gabriel, because he has that posture of humility as he says, "All hail." Now, what's going on here? There's this element of, through divine permission, being allowed to make an engraving to raise our minds and hearts to the invisible, which we have not here visible, but very much invisibly before us. Because right now already they're waiting. And as it comes to the consecration, there'll be a whole army of angels waiting in prostrate adoration for the moment of "this is my body," when erupts into this place the power that made us, depending on just a human whisper. But it has to be there. Now, if they shielded all this in the Old Testament with such majesty and glory, it is a pedagogy for us, which therefore our charismatic friends in France were correct to take seriously. Because superficial renewal goes through the shortcut method. It's just as though we were the first to get it right, bypassing 2 millennia. Now this was a different sort of renewal. It was serene and unhurried. It was also extremely dense. Remember the time taken for prayer. The result on the soul is that it has time to enter into mode. It is permeated by an otherness and enters into a cloud, literally physically, of mystery and majesty, in such a way that it is not at all centre stage, which is the danger in superficial renewal. Limelight, ego trips, noise, also disobedience. If you're celebrating in some charismatic celebrations, you'll find that you're being forced into disobedience. At the elevation of the host, you might find them starting to sing and so on, and things which are not supposed to happen during the consecration itself. Now, obedience is essential to worship, otherwise we're worshipping ourselves. The first worship is that of the will. Therefore one listens to the will expressed in the words of the liturgy itself, of which we are not patrons. So this then is the pedagogy, that they had a place physically where one went with fear and trembling, and only certain people. Also, the element of beauty and elevation. Here, as I mentioned yesterday, we have the good and the bad. Our present hymnals contain both. Very good ancient hymns, beautiful when well sung, even more beautiful when accompanied with good organ music, but you have also the shoddy, often on the same page. Very, very empty, I would say, and ugly praise. It rained and poured for 40 daisies, rained and poured for 40 daisies, nearly drove those animal crazies, children of the Lord. Compare that with the Byzantine liturgy. And yet, you see, we go along with it. It's cool. Well, let me tell you, my friends, it's chilly, not cool, and it warms not one angel on earth, unless it be the angels of the underworld, who I would say are probably not absent from some of our liturgical renewal. Just bear that in mind, that not everything which is new is of God. It's time to conclude. I have here what I wrote after hearing that testimony. In French, testimonies are témoignages, and it was also something that had happened when they were preparing for Ars. Ars was where the Curé Vase lived, of course, but they had recuperated it for renewal once a year. And they'd have them coming from all over France and outside France by their thousand, and they completely take the whole area under their guidance, because it was a massive operation. Ars, like Lourdes, has the basilica, you know, not just the parish church, therefore it can house these big conventions. And all the gifts of the Curé Vase were there, and all the power of the early church. You get 7,000 people one week, another 7,000 a second week there. You get a large number of priests, even bishops. Every celebration was presided by a bishop, I remember, each day. You get all these young people, things start to happen. And one night we were in prayer. It was a Thursday night, I think, because prayer would happen all night there. And things were starting to happen. The basilica was electrified. We all had our eyes closed, and it was deliberately meant to be an evening where the Lord would be free to act. And he did. But the difference was this: it was all being filmed. Now there was a combination of gifts. Words of knowledge, dont de la science, were linked with gifts of healing and prophecy. And things like this might be coming out. There's a lady here who right now is being healed of a sterility and so on. And then all this being filmed, so the following year, when the child is baptized, it would then be shown to be a fulfillment of the prophecy. Other things were happening all the time, one after the other, coup sur coup, as they say. And the instinct was for people to applaud, and they were saying from the altar, don't applaud, restez en silence, for the Lord to work. He didn't like noise. Things like this were coming out. There's a person here with his leg shorter than the other. Right now, the Lord is healing that leg and it's growing to the size of the other. Right now, it's happening before us. All these things were being recorded. So just before we went that time to Ars, we were shown the video that they themselves had made, because they had a video studio of the previous Ars. It was all there, on video. Miracle after miracle after miracle. So there we are. Just wrote this, so moved that the Lord was not at all shy to act, but that we perhaps were too shy to ask him to. Témoignage. In 1986, we were in the Abbaye Blanche. It's a Cistercian monastery which has become a centre of charismatic renewal with its own congregation, the Beatitude. At that time it was called Lion de Juda, and it was growing very quickly, and the Lord was blessing them with many miracles and signs of his providential help, sometimes in quite spectacular ways. And one evening they were playing back a video which they themselves had produced of things which had happened the previous year in Ars, for we were preparing to go to Ars for a large convention. And it was quite evident that the power of the Acts of the Apostles was very much at work, and because they were recording things scientifically, we could see on video the Lord's hand at work. A miracle is but a broken law, and yet, in juggling thus with these thy toys, thou dost sometimes some puzzle set before our troubled eyes. No work thy work destroys, but thou wouldst here twice work a single act, and in thy passing pass our thinking by. When madness lies in film and is called fact, when truth's cogs no more turn, but seem to cry, there is a hugeness in this worrying that doth bespeak a moving from afar. For in this crack a mighty, mighty thing has travelled from a very distant star, that we had thought long burnt, an ancient fire, and yet our hands were numbed at this live